All right, welcome to video 2 of this mini series about planning for e-commerce, and now we're going to talk about identifying costs that we have of going online. All right, so before we go in, there's a couple of warnings I'd like to say. It's very hard to tell you or to estimate the cost of a website. Even for people that are specialists on it, it's never accurate measurement or an accurate estimate. And the same goes for the benefits. Actually, measuring the benefits of the website is even harder than measuring the costs. And there's a lot of ambiguity on this, okay? And why is that? Well, reason one is that technology is changing rapidly. And a lot of times when we start the process of developing the site or developing the e-commerce platform, and by the time we hit halfway through, the technology we are using in a way is already obsolete. And this generates many difficulties, obviously. But there's another positive point is as time goes by, hardware costs are trending down, and that means it's cheaper and cheaper now to get better quality hardware to develop new websites or to develop new e-commerce capabilities. Typically, software costs, in terms of the software components, I would say is that the amount of money you spend is always higher than what you expect. I typically tell, whenever someone asks me how much money it's gonna cost me to develop a site, I already ask a couple of estimates, blah blah blah, and I say, okay, on average, how much did they ask you? And let's imagine they say 5,000, and I always say, well, then double that. You're going to need at least 10,000, because it's really, when it comes to the development of the software of the site, it's really complicated because typically the owner will request many changes during the process, and that will incur costs, obviously. So these changes of technology, indeed, the other thing is that it can completely destroy management plans, and you might have to restart the process because a new technology came out, and if you launch the old technology, it would be obsolete or it would not look so good. So let's talk about what is the total cost of owning an e-commerce business, okay? Total cost of ownership is all the costs related to the electronic commerce implementation. There's a couple of things here. We're talking about hardware costs, software costs, outsource work that you need to do, employee costs, and so on, and site maintenance, obviously, as well. So the assumptions here is the other thing is that we need to assume, the assumption is we need to think about how often will the website need to be updated in the future. So websites that need to be updated, for example, every week will be much more expensive than websites that need to be updated every 6 months, for example. And therefore, the amount of update you need to do is directly proportional to the amount of cost of the website it will have. Not the initial development, but the maintenance cost. This point is specifically about maintenance. Okay, so what are the typical website costs that we have? Obviously, they vary with time and they vary with the type of business. Creating a website for a bank is much more expensive than creating a website for a retailer, for example. But although we know that on average, the proportions tend to be the same. Typically, we spend, out of all the money we need to spend, 10% is to pay for hardware, 10% is to pay for software. And when I say software here, I mean things that, for example, licensing, hostings, and so on. And 80% of the cost will be for labor, the people that have to work on this project. So, and just to give you an idea, if you just want to open a small online store, typically for less than $1,000 you can already do it. There's many people online on websites that for something between $600 to $1,000 will create the whole website for it. For example, my brother created his online shop for, I believe it was 800 euros, something like that. So as you can see, it's not really that bad. But if you have a small to a mid-size online business and you need to have full transaction and payment processing on that site, then the cost can go anywhere from $10,000 to $1 million, for example, because it becomes much more complicated and it requires much more labor. So in terms of annual costs of maintenance, now here it will depend again how often you need to update it. But normally what we see, my experience tells me that maintenance of a website typically somewhere between 50% and 200% a year of the cost of creating the site. So for example, if your website costed $1,000 to create, then you can expect to spend something like $500 to $2,000 a year just on maintenance. And just to give you an example, I found this table, I think it's quite good. For example, a small, and it just to show you the proportion. And websites can be extremely expensive to create. Obviously, a large corporation might spend something like 5 million to 100 million on creating a website or on creating their online business. And for example, these values are quite normal if you're talking about, for example, airplane tickets or hotel booking services. They're quite expensive. And here what would happen is the maintenance costs go over the roof because they are very update intensive, for example. So one quick point I also want to make is when selecting the hosting of your website, hosting means that it's going to be a server or a business that basically makes sure your website is accessible. You don't necessarily need a hosting. You can do it in-house, but most typically we outsource it to specialized companies because it can be quite expensive to have it in-house, with few exceptions, obviously. The couple 6 characteristics I'd like to say when selecting a hosting, obviously, it's not just about the cheapest one. It should be about functionality, reliability, scalability, security, backup and recovery, and obviously the cost. But I consider cost to be the least important one. Functionality is about, obviously, does it provide good connection? Does it give you good analytics? Does it give you support your software, and so on? Reliability is the guarantee that the website will be uptime all the time, that there will be ease of connection, that does not take too much time to load, for example, and so on. Scalability is, does this hosting service give you the ability to expand with ease from 1,000 visitors a day to 10,000 visitors a day, for example, or it only focuses, or it's very complicated to grow the hosting service within that business. That's a very important point in case the number of visits you have to your site suddenly increases. Security, I think it's obviously security of the data, security of payment transactions, and so on. Backup and recovery is the frequency of backups for the website. Remember, the website is, in a way, it's a software that is running on the internet, and therefore it is important to have backups in case stuff goes wrong, especially if you have websites or e-commerce components related to internal operations. And finally, cost, the price, obviously. But like I said, I think price is the least important one. So to summarize on this video, I cover some of the components you have to be careful about: the costs, especially when it comes to website costs, and to selecting a hosting. It is important that you put all these costs well defined from the beginning, although many of them it's going to be almost impossible to know a precise number. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video of this mini series.